Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the life of history's absolute greatest conqueror. We're talking about a guy whose life is basically the ultimate Icarus Arc. We're going to chart a meteoric rise that completely shattered the known world and then, well, followed it up with a tragic, chaotic, and just incredibly abrupt descent. We are, of course, talking about Alexander the Great.
Right off the bat, I want you to keep this number in your head, 32. Keep thinking about that age as we go through this explainer, because by this remarkably young age, Alexander had already conquered a territory stretching from Greece all the way to modern-day Pakistan. He literally forged one of the largest empires ever known in this astonishing 10-year blitz. And then, at just 32 years old, he suddenly died. It's honestly kind of wild to even wrap your head around how a single person achieves that much, that fast.
Okay, let's jump right into section 1, The Boy King Rises. To really get Alexander, we've got to look at the world that forged him. So Alexander definitely didn't start from scratch. His dad, King Philip II, took Macedonia, which, the sophisticated Greeks down south viewed as a total backwater, and transformed it into this absolute juggernaut of a military power. Philip managed to unite a totally fractured Greece and drew up this incredibly grand plan to invade the ailing superpower right next door, the Persian Empire. But then, in 336 BC, Philip gets assassinated by his own bodyguard. Enter Alexander. He's only 20 years old, he's brilliant, he's been tutored by Aristotle himself. But he doesn't just quietly sit on the throne. Oh no, he ruthlessly secures it. He crushes local rebellions and makes a brutal, terrifying example of the ancient city of Thebes, just completely destroying it and selling its people into slavery. By 334 BC, the boy king is ready. He crosses into Asia Minor, determined to execute his father's grand vision. Moving on to section 2, the unstoppable war machine. Because grand plans are one thing, right? But execution is a whole different beast. What's really fascinating here is the sheer synergy of his 40,000-strong army. It was essentially a giant anvil and a hammer. The anvil was the infantry, the phalangites. Picture this. They form up 16 ranks deep into a solid wall of iron spear tips. From the front, virtually unstoppable. But a massive, clunky block of men like that is pretty vulnerable on the sides. So he uses the hypaspists, these elite agile infantrymen, to guard the flanks. And then you have the hammer, the companion cavalry. These were his elite shock troops, highly mobile horsemen that Alexander himself would frequently lead into battle to just shatter enemy lines. You can actually see the stark mathematical advantage they had right here. The Macedonian sarissa was a massive 18-foot pike. Now compare that to the standard 8-foot spears used by the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia. In a head-to-head clash, the enemy simply couldn't get close enough to strike the Macedonians without getting impaled. It was just a brutal, undeniable technological edge. Which brings us to section 3, smashing the Persian Empire. Armed with this machine, Alexander marched directly into the teeth of the Persian Empire. The scale of what he was up against is just staggering. Take the Battle of Issus. The Persian army, led by King Darius himself, was estimated to be up to 100,000 strong. They outnumbered the Greeks nearly 2 to 1. The asymmetric stakes were incredibly high. But Alexander? He used the narrow terrain at Issus to funnel those massive Persian numbers, completely nullifying their advantage, and led a headlong cavalry charge straight at the Persian center. But listen, these victories were absolutely not won from a safe distance in a command tent. Alexander led from the absolute bleeding edge of the front line. Take this visceral account from an earlier clash at the River Granicus. Alexander gets charged by 2 Persian nobles. One of them strikes him on the head and literally breaks his helmet. Another raises a sword behind him to finish the job. But, as the account details, one of his commanders, Black Cletus, anticipates the blow and severs the Persian's arm, sword and all. That captures exactly who Alexander was. Fearless, or maybe just reckless to the point of insanity. Let's see how all of this builds into pure tactical genius at the decisive Battle of Gaugamela. Once again, he's outnumbered, and this time they're on flat, open ground. So what does he do? Well, first, he marches his army out to the right. This totally confuses the Persians, who mirror him to prevent being outflanked, which ends up stretching their own massive line. Second, Alexander lures the Persian cavalry into a massive skirmish, fixing them in position on the wing. And then the trap snaps shut. A gap opens in the weakened Persian center, and Alexander charges his elite companion cavalry straight through it, directly at King Darius. The sudden ferocity throws the Persians into an utter panic. Darius flees, and the empire just cracks wide open. Next stop, Babylon. All right, section 4, to the world's edge. At this point, Alexander is the undisputed ruler of the Persian Empire. But this is the major turning point of our story, because he doesn't stop. Just rapidly track this timeline with me, because the pace is relentless. In 330 BC, he burns the ceremonial capital of Persepolis. By 329, he's all the way up in modern Tajikistan fighting a gritty guerrilla war and founding Alexandria Eshkhat, which literally translates to Alexandria the Furthest. By 327, he marries a Bactrian lord's daughter, Roxana, and pushes his totally exhausted army over the Hindu Kush Mountains into modern Pakistan and India. In 326, he's fighting his costliest battle ever at the river Hydaspes, against an army fielding massive war elephants.
So the crucial point here is that during this grueling eastward march, Alexander undergoes a deep, deep psychological shift. Much to the absolute dismay of his Macedonian veterans, he starts adopting the dress and customs of his defeated Persian enemies. He even tries to force his fellow Greeks to perform proskinesis, basically prostrating themselves on the ground before him. To the Greeks, this was a terrifying blasphemy. Only a god deserved that kind of treatment. His paranoia and arrogance just skyrocket. He starts executing trusted generals on mere suspicion of conspiracy. And worst of all, in a drunken argument, he murders Clitus the Black. Yeah, the exact same man who saved his life back at the Granicus. He is actively alienating the very men who built his empire.
And eventually, it snaps. At the river Hyphasis, Alexander wants to push even further east, thoroughly convinced he's close to the literal edge of the world. But his army? They say no. It's a full-on mutiny. I mean, think about it. These men haven't seen their homes in 8 years. They've marched thousands of miles. They're battered, they're exhausted, and they're hearing rumors of gigantic Indian armies waiting just ahead. They simply refuse to take another step. And so, a furious, pouting Alexander is finally forced to turn his army around.
And that leads us to Section 5, a fractured legacy. The sudden, incredibly anticlimactic conclusion to a life defined by perpetual motion. After a brutal, agonizing march back across the desert, Alexander returns to Babylon. And what does he do? He immediately begins planning an invasion of Arabia. But then, out of nowhere, he develops a sudden fever. Days later, history's greatest conqueror is dead, at just 32 years old. And because he was so hyper-focused on endless conquest, he left absolutely zero plans for succession. His vast, wobbly empire, which was basically held together entirely by his own overwhelming personality, instantly shatters. His generals immediately kick off a series of brutal wars to carve the territory up among themselves. But, out of all this chaos, the Hellenistic age is born. Greek culture, art, and science permanently fused with local traditions all across the Middle East and Asia. I really want to leave you with this final thought. On one hand, you look at the unparalleled brilliance of his tactics, the sheer impossibility of his conquests, and this massive cultural fusion he kickstarted. But on the other hand, you have to weigh the absolute trail of devastation, the intense paranoia, the murdered friends, and the fractured, warring world he left behind, all because he just couldn't bring himself to stop. So what do you think? Was Alexander a grand visionary, or was he a bloodthirsty tyrant totally consumed by his own unchecked ambition? It's a debate that's been raging for over 2 millennia. And honestly, it's what makes unpacking his life so endlessly fascinating. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer today, and as always, keep questioning the history you think you know.